Good morning. This is Elisa Laurel, Program Manager with WRCOG. Thank you for joining our 5th episode of the Future Forward series. We're glad you can join us this morning. While we wait for a few more guests to join the broadcast, please be sure to go to slido.com, spelled SLIDO.com, and type in the event code forward, FORWARD, and the number 5, forward, FORWARD, and the number 5 to submit any questions for the broadcast. We'll be getting started in about a minute. Thank you for joining us today.
Did you guys know that used motor oil can be recycled too? If you didn't know, now you know, and make sure you check out our website to learn more. Good morning, my name is Elisa Laurel, Program Manager at the Western Riverside Council of Governments, otherwise known as WRCOG, and we are honored and excited you can join us for the 5th episode of our Future Forward series. For our viewers that are new out there, here at WRCOG, we serve as a regional agency that focuses on helping many of our cities and jurisdictions. In the Western Riverside County subregion, we focus on areas such as transportation, planning, energy, environment, and conservation, just to name a few. And before we jump into our presentation, I want to thank our in-kind sponsors as usual for helping to support our event and our broadcast, the Inland Empire Regional Chamber of Commerce and the Southern California Association of Governments. Thank you guys so much for your continued support. So as many of you know the drill, but just in case you don't and you're new to our channel, make sure that you submit your questions via our Slido app. That's spelled SLIDO.com. Otherwise, if you want to go ahead and scan the QR code, go ahead and scan the QR code that appears in the corner of the screen. Hopefully I'm getting better at it and pointing out where it's going to appear, but go ahead and take your cell phone and scan the QR code. Make sure that you type in event code forward, FORWARD, and the number 5, again, forward, FORWARD, and the number 5. Additionally, because this is a YouTube link, you have the luxury of pausing and going back if you have missed any information. Also be sure to subscribe down below, hit the like button as well. Make sure that we're getting the right information to you. We always want to hear feedback. So without further ado, today's broadcast focuses on navigating virtual governance and the Brown Act in a COVID-19 climate. Today's meeting spaces and places look a lot different nowadays, many of which are being handled virtually. So what have we learned about virtual public meetings under the governor's executive order? How have our interactions changed with the public? Is engagement and turnout being impacted? You know, these are all questions that we're going to answer here today on today's broadcast. So we've got an esteemed panel that I'm happy to introduce to you. Mike Maurer, partner at BB&K, Bill Higgins, executive director at CalCog, and Kevin Bash, mayor pro tem at the city of Norco and executive and chair for our executive committee here at WRCOG. So we're excited to invite our esteemed panel of guests today to the virtual broadcast. Bill Higgins with CalCog will be facilitating this exciting discussion. So Bill, turning it over to you.
Thank you, Elisa. I'm pleased to be here with my two co-panelists. Let me introduce myself first. I am Bill Higgins, the Executive Director of the California Association of Councils of Governments, and will be serving as the moderator during this first session of the webinar. To my right on my screen is Kevin Bash, and I'll let him introduce himself.
I'm Kevin Bash. I'm the Mayor Pro Tem with the City of Norco. I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
And to my other side?
Thanks, Bill. I'm Mike Maurer. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Best & Krieger, and I serve as city attorney for the cities of San Jacinto and La Habra Heights. And I should note that Best & Krieger is a proud partner of WRCOG, and we also serve as general counsel to WRCOG.
And we're
Norco. You guys do us too.
There you go. Well, we wanted to talk a little bit today about virtual meetings and the Brown Act and what we've learned so far. And maybe a good place to start is with you, Kevin, and maybe you can just share your experience with virtual meetings, maybe from the first one that was probably a bit of a roller coaster to what you've learned so far.
Well, the first one was, well, first off, when you're looking at the screen, you feel like you're on the Brady Bunch. Remember in the old days, the TV show, the sound goes down, the visual goes down. We had to all learn the technology. If something went wrong and you were stuck, you didn't know how to get out of it. A lot of calls to our folks that are expert in that at the City of Norco. Our first meeting, it was difficult to find ways because people could not come to the meetings. It was difficult to find ways to incorporate the public. And we learned very quickly, you have to talk into them. I mean, stupid things. You got to talk into the microphone. You have to make sure that you can be seen, you can be heard. And then when public comments come up, we've had times in the beginning where we literally read letter after letter after letter, which became very difficult. During our meetings, we're constantly checking to see how many people are watching. And then we make sure that those meetings are rebroadcast several times, in fact, all the time, so that people can catch up and find out what's going on. We all learned as council people to begin to post our meetings to let people know what was happening. I have a funny feeling we're not going to go back in a lot of ways. I think people are getting used to this. It's very convenient. When we had meetings amongst council people, we had to make sure that meetings were short because people's attention tends to drift and they start multitasking. You can see them doing it at their desks. You also had to make sure that as much as possible, everybody's mics worked so that everybody had input and could talk, but at the same time, they just didn't capture and run away with the entire meeting. We're getting better and better at it. That's kind of our experience right now.
Excellent. Well, Mike, and you were in the situation where probably you had several council members in cities asking you, what do I do? What does this emergency order mean? Can I have a public meeting? What have you learned over the course of the last 4 months?
Yes, it's hard to think back to, we're in August now, thinking back to March, it feels like a different era at this point, but remember, for all of us, we've handled public meetings a certain way our entire careers. This isn't a situation we've ever seen before. We've never done virtual meetings like this before. And I don't know that we've ever even thought about doing virtual meetings like this before. It seems so straightforward now, looking back, but back in March, I don't think we were talking about, hey, someday maybe we'd go all virtual. So it was really something that happened on the fly. When we first started hearing about the potential for a pandemic, that was one of the first thoughts is, what do we do with the Brown Act? We're hearing that there aren't going to be gatherings, but we still have to do business. We still have to do public meetings. So how's that going to happen? So fortunately, we were able to pivot. There were 2 different orders from the governor. The first one originally still required a physical meeting location. And then the next week we went completely virtual. So it was really, quite a dramatic shift. And it took all hands on deck. You need someone with the IT expertise to get it set up. You need to coordinate with the city clerk to figure out how to handle public comments and all that. So it was really quite a shock, but I echo what Kevin said, is now several months into it, it's starting to feel normal and starting to feel convenient in a lot of ways.
Well, and maybe I'll kick that question back over to Kevin. In terms of convenience, what are you noticing from the public? Are they more pleased, less pleased? Are there different pockets? What are you hearing?
You have to be really careful of rehab of the controversial topics. We have a very large development that's coming into Norco, and we have had to bend over backwards to make sure people know that they're being heard. And a lot of people are not happy with the fact that they feel that there's no input that they've been able to give to us and that's affected any change. I think if there's any, it's very convenient for us in terms of WRCOG meetings, different meetings. I don't have to get in the car, I don't have to drive. But for the public, they're not able to stand in front of us, and they're not able to see us and look at us and tell us what they think. I think that is that's a true loss, and I really worry that if we go to more and more virtual stuff, we will lose a lot of the public connection. The city of Norco has really bent over backwards to try to reach out and talk to people and make sure we know how they're feeling, talk to the different groups. But I think that for the public, this is a huge, it's a loss. It's a loss. They want to see us. They want to talk to us. They want to know and look on our face and say, did you hear what I'm saying? People want to be heard. And through this, we don't always know. Like right now, I'm talking to a machine.
A nice one, I hope. A good talking head. There you go. Well, and actually, I want to follow up on that, because I've also talked with local officials who've been impressed by the increased participation that they've had. They've had more people being able to tune in because they didn't have to hop in a car or leave their kids at home or things like that that previously made such meetings inaccessible. Have you seen different people attending your meetings that weren't there before?
I'd have to say just mainly a lot less. Norco normally has quite a bit of participation at our council meetings, which I understand is pretty rare. There's just been less. But for example, last night, I think we had 18 people watching our meeting. And we normally have 20 to 30 people at our meetings at the very least. So, and we were discussing some huge issues last night.
Okay, so in Norco, you've seen maybe it trail off a little bit.
Yeah. And I mean, we're in the middle of an election year, and that's the other part of it is people, there's no way to see the candidates. So there's all these little subtle things that are happening.
Okay. Mike, you've worked with several different cities. What's been your experience?
And I think it's, this is really a case for how important a local council or local government is to the community. Because each local council, each city council understands what's going to serve their constituents best. In a lot of ways, it really highlights why so many local officials fight for local control. And the reason I say that is talking with different officials around the state and other city attorneys, other mayors and folks like that, you see a mixed bag. There are a lot of cities who feel like this has really expanded our reach. A lot more people are coming to our meetings. People are able to tune into the item they want to hear and leave on the stuff they're not interested in. It provides more flexibility for people who might be working or have kids at home. So you hear the flip side of it as well. I think, as Kevin mentions with Norco, it's fantastic to, as a public official, you want to see a full room when you're in there. And it's great to have that regularly. So I think to lose that just highlights that what works in one city isn't necessarily going to work in another city. And maybe work isn't the right term, but what's best for one community may not be best for another community. Now, keep in mind going forward, we're all looking forward to the point where we don't have to worry about having a room full of people anymore. And then I think we're looking into, can we have a hybrid approach that really meets the best of both worlds?
Kevin, do you think a hybrid approach would be a good combination for locals going forward after this?
I think that that's what's going to happen. I think that we actually already videoed our council meetings so you could see them. But I just had a thought. by doing this, you can shut people off, and you touched on local control. You could use this machine and run cities from Sacramento, which I think some people want to do. And I worry that this technology itself may eventually lead to maybe the impression that you're able to govern farther and farther away. But I do think a hybrid, to your question, I do think that the hybrid's coming. And I think that it does, once people get used, the younger people get it. It's the old people like me that we had to learn all this stuff, and they just crank it out. So I think it's coming. Yeah, it's here.
So Mike, do you think Kevin looks old?
Of course not.
Yeah.
Good answer.
So, well, let's
his attorney, his law firm works for us at times, so he's got to say that. And a bunch of his lawyers live in our city, so
sorry about that. So what about that? Let's talk about the Brown Act itself for a second. And Mike, maybe drawing on your experience, how can what do we need to address in the Brown Act so we strike the right balance between access and transparency, which are the foundations of the Brown Act, and availing ourselves to this technology to make it even more accessible, meetings more accessible?
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, that access and transparency are the keys. So anything we're talking about with technology moving forward, it's with the base that it shouldn't be done in a way that limits access and transparency from where we are now. As far as a change in the Brown Act, I think the starting point here is to look at the rule that the governor suspended. The way that telephone meetings work under the Brown Act is a council member can actually telephone into a meeting under the rules right now, but the council member has to post the meeting and post his location and make it public, which really ends up not making a lot of sense. I've had council members in other countries who have to post the location of the hotel they're at. At one point, I had a board member of a special district who was telephoning into meetings because his wife was having some health problems and was immunocompromised. And so he couldn't be going into a meeting. This was years ago, before the pandemic. And I had to be the attorney telling him, that's fine if you want to telephone into the meeting, but you have to post your address on the agenda, and you've got to let members of the public come into your house. Now, of course, we probably would have canceled the meeting if that were to occur, but it just highlights the absurdity of this rule, that we've got someone telephoning in. I understand the desire for a face-to-face confrontation, but the reason they're telephoning in is because they can't be face-to-face. So, I think at this point, we can look at that teleconference rule and just see that it looks pretty absurd right now. And whatever we do to move forward, I think just eliminating that posting rule, enabling council members to be at an electronic or telephonic location, as long as it's broadcast, as long as the public can listen in, I think that's really the key. It just makes so much more sense than the hoops we have to jump through right now.
So square to square instead of face to face.
Correct. Or over the phone. If it's over the phone, if you can hear what's going on, obviously that's not necessarily the most ideal, but I don't think a lot of members of the public are going to fly to your hotel and maybe if you're in Hawaii, maybe they'll fly there to join the meeting, but I think in most cases they probably aren't going to.
Fair enough. Well, I think that's a really good. Kevin, what are your responses to that? Does that sound like reasonable ideas? Have you ever been in a situation where you've had to post your location?
No, we've been really lucky in that we've always accounted. We never miss meetings. At least thus far we haven't missed any. So everybody has shown up. I think in my 10 years and 12 years on council, I think I've had one council member who was out of state that had to phone in. And I don't know if she posted or not, but we just haven't had to deal with that.
Okay. Well, let me ask another question. One of the issues I hear with this is discussion. It's a good venue to have a discussion. We have yet had a lot of situations where we've had effective hybrid meetings where you have people, you know, like a majority of the council in place and then 2 calling in and the public there. I mean, we haven't done that yet. But one of the questions is voting. Recording the vote. Sometimes I hear that the voting process takes longer than the discussions because mics are on and off, they're mutes. And it seems like there should be an easier way to make voting happen. Mike, why don't I start with you because you've been at more cities. Have you seen a best practice, or is, you know, can we just use the yes or no buttons in Zoom to vote?
Yeah, so the present practice with the Brown Act is to do roll call votes whenever anyone's on the telephone, and that makes a lot of sense in this sort of a meeting, because, you know, the hardest thing in these meetings is when multiple people are talking at once. So if you say, everyone say aye and they all say aye, you're just not going to know who it is that's saying it. And, you know, there is a public interest, both for members of the public and for council members, to have people know how they voted on an item. So I think for something like a city council where you've got 5 members, it's fairly easy to do a roll call vote. There's definitely some times where it can get frustrating, but it's, you know, not that tough. I know there are other agencies that have a significant number of votes. I think one of your members, Bill, the Southern California Association of Governments, I believe did a roll call of 130 members or something like that.
That was scintillating. But actually, one of the things that meeting did, and that was their regional council meeting, because I watched that meeting and I monitored that meeting, and they actually, so I didn't want to talk. So they gave me an option to watch the live stream without actually logging in and taking up a square in the Zoom meeting, which I thought was a really good way to make your meeting accessible for people like me who just wanted to sit in the audience and not crowd the Hollywood squares that was, in that case, was the Zoom meeting. So I thought that was a kind of a unique solution, a nice solution for that, because they had like 300 people on the call.
And if there's a voting button on the Zoom or the other app you're using that says who voted yes and who voted no, I mean, I don't think you lose anything from a transparency standpoint by voting that way and having it published somewhere. So it seems like something that could be easily going forward. Oh,
wait, we have been Zoom bombed. We are, your answer has been interrupted. Kevin, have you ever been Zoom bombed, or has your meeting been interrupted?
Not in an official meeting, but in one of my service groups, we got bombed by a bunch of high school kids. They were bombing one of the people who was in our service group's meeting. It was clean, so I haven't been to one of the dirty ones yet.
And Mike, you've probably experienced something like this in some of the meetings you've been advising.
Fortunately, I've been pretty lucky, but obviously it's happened throughout the state. And you know, the way I look at it is we've got new technology, but not necessarily new challenges. You know, I've been in plenty of board meetings that have had interruptions that we've had to take a recess or clear the room or whatever it is. And, you know, there are some things you hear with some of the Zoom bomb incidents that are just unspeakable, and it's horrible that those types of things have happened. But as far as public officials dealing with a meeting, it's, you know, something we learn to roll with. So it's true.
And well, then let me take that a step further, because this technology makes meetings more accessible to more people. Does it make it easier for outside interests, kind of the interest that Kevin, I'm not thinking the state here as much as I'm just thinking other advocacy groups, to, you know, on Facebook say, hey, the city of Norco is taking up this certain ordinance, and then you have, 500 out of town people join your meeting?
Well, last night we had an attorney from Los Angeles who felt that it was his place to tell us how to do our zoning. That was not fun. We've had recently Norco had a big blow up in terms of a protest march that occurred, and we had a bunch of counter protesters that came in from out of town and turned it into a awful, horrible event. So you do have that. That night or a couple nights later, we actually had to sit through a meeting where we read 30 or 40 letters, and they had to all be read into the record. We were there till 12:30, 1:45 at night. And so sometimes that becomes difficult, and almost none of them were from Norco. But they have a right, and we signed up to listen to them and hear them, and if we can act on it at some time, we have to do it. So I like the input from the outside at times, but 1:45 in the morning, and I've heard the same letter over and over again. It makes it very difficult, but the Constitution says they get to do it, so I support that.
Mike, any response?
Yeah, it's just a tough balance. You certainly, you want to take different viewpoints. You definitely, the point of having open meetings and public comments is it's for your community, but your community can always benefit from, or I shouldn't say always, but there are times that you can benefit from an outside viewpoint as well. But at the end of the day, we also have business that needs to get taken care of. Mm-hmm. So I think it's something that we're going to figure out more and more going forward. You kind of get a sense when you're in the room and there's a big crowd, then you've got to keep things moving along. You certainly don't want an outside group to filibuster your meeting. So it's, when everyone's in the room, you have a sense and you can move it along. And it is more challenging when you're on Zoom or some other electronic medium. But I think we just have to find that balance between making sure you're taking all the viewpoints, and if your warrants are at the end of the agenda, you have to pay your bills, so you've got to get to it at some point.
Right. So let's kind of talk about maybe, we've talked about different issues. I think that let me just raise, I guess, if we are going to go to a more technological access, it also suggests that that we need to be able to assure that there's equal access technologically to those meetings, so that requires us to take a look at our broadband capabilities throughout all of our communities, because otherwise we're just granting access to those who have, right? And particularly as we're becoming more aware of social justice issues, we have to maybe think about access, not just in terms of the technology, but also in terms of who has access to the technology. Now, I'm guessing that Norco's broadband access is pretty universal. I'm just going out on a limb there. Am I correct on that?
With some of the little things, a lot of people, seniors, would use the senior center's computers. It's closed. One of the big hidden terrible things that's occurred is when you close the libraries, you close access to a lot of people that cannot, kids and adults that can't access the internet. And because that's where their computer is, or they don't have enough power in their device, or don't even have a device. It's hard to follow these meetings on your phone if you're not that savvy. The youngsters, they tend to know how to do it, but that broadband, Norco's in pretty good shape, but we are.
But there are other issues to access that you're poinning out.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Exactly right. There's a whole population out there that is not tech savvy, who already before the pandemic felt they were not being connected to. So you have to. In the past, you go to the senior center, you interact, you go to the senior housing units, you meet people, you talk to them, you ask them how they're doing, you give them your card, you hope they call. Now that's an entire avenue of communication that is cut off, which means they are cut off. Plus, they're afraid. They don't want to go out. And there's a whole society out there, a group of people that are completely cut off from us. And that's something that's going to have to be taken care of. It's going to have to be addressed somehow.
Well, and Mike, maybe you can comment. I think, you know, both types of meeting, in person and virtual, allow access and maybe cut off access to different groups of people. And so the hybrid, you would think, would allow the most people to come, but you still are granting kind of, some people have more benefits than others. You know, I guess this is probably not a city attorney question as much as it is a policy question for the League of California Cities and others about, if you support more virtual meetings, can we also support more virtual access broadband, you know, library open hours, things like that, that will allow people to take advantage of those public meetings. And that's more of a comment than a question, but I'll let you respond. Mike.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. I think the point Kevin makes is fantastic. You know, a lot of times when we think about access, you know, we're thinking about income inequality and the ability to afford broadband or have it, you know, geographical inequality, I guess you could call it, if broadband isn't available in the area you live in. But there's also a gap between technological capabilities. So, you know, I think these questions raise larger issues that go beyond the Brown Act. You know, obviously the goal with the Brown Act and local meetings is we want to provide access as broadly as possible. But I think it comes back to, again, sort of you know, it's a habit in my profession to hammer this term, but local control and understanding in your community what sort of gaps in access there are. You know, I think that it's really highlighted by the point Kevin makes about the gaps that Norco has, which are going to be different from the gaps that a more rural community has, or a more, you know, lower income community or something like that. So I think really understanding what your gaps are and figuring out how to address them. If access to a council meeting helps, you know, identify and address those gaps, I think that's overall a good thing.
Norco's an anomaly. Our average age is 62 years old. So that means we have more of that population that is disconnected right now in the last, especially since the pandemic. Norco, we're small enough that if you have somebody that comes to the senior center, and nobody sees them for a couple of weeks, they get well-being calls. They get called by staff members because we know everybody. And so we've tried through this pandemic to reach out, because there's no connection at all. There is no virtual connection. We do have a lot of classes and stuff that we offer seniors so that they can learn this technology, but it's hard. It's tough.
So let me ask a different question here. I think most public agencies have had their meetings on Zoom. Maybe some have tried other platforms, which is really a platform that isn't designed especially for public meetings, right? So my question is, if you were designing a platform, or maybe what do we need Zoom to do to really work for our public meetings long term? I'll start by putting up a voting screen just for the voters, or just having the city council members on the screen and have people come on just to help them track the city council members in the sea of squares that sometimes are public meetings. Kevin, do you have any suggestions along those lines that you would like to see in a meeting? Here, and I'm sure the vice president of Zoom is watching this, so just assume that you get our WebEx.
Well, in a perfect world, you remember when you go to Disneyland, they have the big screens, gigantic screens.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting to have bigger screens, and if we have to do it that way, the way we interact sometimes with some of our programs, it would be nice if people could do that. If we could see them if there were ways to do that so that they were bigger. I guess for me, bigger would be, although then what comes to mind are the old movies where the Wizard of Oz. I don't want that effect, but it would be nice if you have to do that, that maybe things were just bigger, and because in a way, bigger seems more immediate. And in all of this, I genuinely fear that we're going to train an entire generation of people that will learn to talk to machines before they talk to people. I'm an educator, and I already see that. They can't look you in the eye, and they kind of look around, but they know how to look at that screen. So maybe if we enlarge it, or I don't know. I don't know if there's going to be a perfect system. I wish I had the answer, but anything that makes it more immediate, I guess, and I'm not sure what that looks like. I have a hunch in the next 10 years, because of this, everything's going to change how we communicate. And I really think so.
Mike, from an attorney standpoint, and maybe even a meeting efficiency standpoint, do you see anything on the platforms that would help a public meeting?
Well, this will be a very stereotypical attorney answer for you, but more control over it.
Surprise!
So, maybe it's just a matter of all of us just getting better at using the technology that's already out there. But I think one thing we've seen is actually being able to see people's faces and their reactions, even on a screen, is more beneficial than over the phone or something like that, or if you have so many people that you can't see who's talking. So I think an efficient model that keeps the council members, and then the city manager, and then you can add in the staff member and the member of the public that's talking, and that way whoever's involved in the conversation is on the screen, and there's some control over it, and everyone who's not on the screen is muted, and there's some way to get in there if you have to. If I have to jump in as the attorney, I have a way. I think that's really the ideal system. Now, can we get there? I assume we can. 2 years ago, I didn't imagine having a system like this that we have now with Zoom. So it's, I think it's closer than we realize.
See, I picture a system that would allow people to check off the issue that they want to testify on, and would queue them up so that when it is time for public testimony, they would roll in and they'd have their little timer, and counsel would be on the screen. See, I picture that there could be something like that, where it's really designed with a public meeting in mind, which Zoom Vice President, if you're listening, there are only 400 and some odd cities, more counties, school districts, a lot of clients there for them to develop that product. Just saying.
And
thoughts about that?
A lot of cities use they use video software that integrates with the agenda. So you'll project the meeting, and the agenda item and the staff report are on the screen next to it. And so I think being able to integrate something like that with the collaboration on Zoom, I think something like that is really what you're mentioning.
Yeah, I think that would be something that would help people engage and know, and also just help the meetings run a little bit smoother. And like I said, Zoom is for a meeting, where a roundtable meeting, and local meetings are often with the council members at the dais making decisions, and it hasn't reflected that kind of conversation, encouraging the member-to-member meeting, and that's just what I think. Kevin, what you're being quiet now as Mike and I do Zoom's product research for them. What do you think?
I just suspect that we're going to end up, I think that we're going to change how we do everything. And I think that the desire is going to lead to doing this better and better and better and better. And I don't know what that's going to look like. And maybe we look at some of the movies that, you've got 3D people stay. I don't know. I don't know how this is all going to play out, but I think that we are now going down a road that we're not going to turn around from. And I think that the connection, more and more we will connect through these little boxes, and then it's just going to get exponentially more complex and easier at the same time, and cheaper, because more and more people will use it.
So in that future, Kevin, when we're changing, what is the most important elements of public engagement, the meeting, our democratic process? What do we need to preserve in those meetings to assure that we're holding on to what we have?
I don't think you can preserve what the most important thing is. For me, the most important thing is that I want to stand toe to toe in front of a person and talk to them. And I truly fear that we are losing that. You have kindergarten kids that are now learning. You have pre-K kids that are now right now sitting in front of computers, and they're being taught by someone who is 50 miles away. And that sounds great, but you don't have that. There's something that happens when you have a group of people, just even two people, that come together. And I genuinely fear that ultimately we are going to morph into something else. And I think that we will lose that face-to-face, touch-to-touch. We don't even shake hands anymore. And right now our society is, we do a lot of finger pointing, and it's much easier to finger point on social media than it is to stand in front of somebody and say, bad person or a good person. And I fear we're going to lose that. We're becoming because of these machines, we're becoming a meaner society. I really do believe that. So I'm lucky in Norco. I thought about moving up and been offered chances to move up, but I like the smaller town where I can talk to people. And I genuinely, as elected official, I miss that. I miss being able to knock on somebody's door and say, "Hi, I'm your councilman. I'm just walking the neighborhood. How you doing? What do you need?" And just shooting the breeze. There's something about, we don't shoot the breeze anymore. So that's my fear.
Mike, what do we need to do to preserve an effective balance of transparency and efficiency? What do we need? What do you think, if you were designing the future?
Of transparency and efficiency?
Or what would the Brown Act of the future need?
Give you the easy question.
Give you the hard one.
You got the hard one.
I think the easy answer is to get rid of the teleconference rule the way it is and have an option for teleconferencing that makes sense. But don't have that be the only option. I think we are going to go back to in-person meetings, as the norm when we get through this. It'll have some element of this. I think there's definitely going to be things like special meetings where it's just easier to do it on Zoom, and it may be nice to do that going forward. So I think on a very basic level, just doing that simple update to the Brown Act is an easy start. And the more challenging part is the issue that Kevin raises, which is, can you stay engaged the same way with your community going forward if folks are more used to seeing you in a little box on a screen? And I think that's trickier. I would say one of the biggest things we've lost over the last few months, I've been at quite a few meetings on Zoom the last few months where we've honored someone from the community in one regard or another. A youth who did a community project that benefited the community, or a veteran that returned to the community or something like that. And so it's great for a city council to be able to bring someone like that up to the dais and truly honor them. And I think we've lost that these last few months, and it's a shame for the people being honored. So I think, maybe if I'm here on the spot trying to think of ways to keep people engaged and coming out to meetings, I think certainly, looking to highlight those kind of things, the important things in your community that you can honor, is a way to do it. But I think it's something we're going to keep searching for as we go through this change and trying to figure out.
Well, I think that about wraps up our time. So I think we're going to turn it over to questions now. So I'm going to hand it over to the folks at Western Riverside COG to do that.
Well, thank you, Bill and Kevin, for joining today's episode. We will now be turning it over to the Q&A portion of our broadcast. I just wanted to remind everyone, please be sure to scan the QR code that appears in the corner of the screen. Make sure to submit your questions in that respect. Go ahead and take your cell phone, scan the QR code, and enter event code FORWARD, FORWARD, and the number 5. Again, FORWARD, and the number 5. Or go ahead and go to slido.com, SLIDO.com, and type in FORWARD, FORWARD, and the number 5. So as we get those questions teed up, I just wanted to go ahead and introduce my colleague and the voice of our popular podcast series, The COGcast. Rachel Singer serves as our communications extraordinaire for WRCOG, and she'll be facilitating your questions. So as they come in, don't be shy. Make sure you get those questions submitted via slido.com, event code FORWARD, and the number 5. So without further ado, inviting our guests back to the virtual stage, Rachel will be facilitating your questions. So Rachel, turning it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Elisa. Well, thank you so much for joining in and tuning in for the Future Forward episode. As Elisa mentioned, if you would like to participate in our live Q&A, go ahead and go to the Slido app and type in forward 5, 5 is in the number, and then that should take you to the correct live Q&A and live poll feed. And so we're going to start off the live Q&A session with just reviewing one of the polls that we had going throughout the presentation. And so that is, do you feel more engaged at online or in-person meetings? And we have a really interesting turnout. And so I'm curious if I can have some feedback from our representatives. And we have about 80% of people said that they were more engaged in in-person events. So Bill, does this shock you at all that it wasn't 100? Or what do you think about that?
Well, I think this makes the point that Kevin was making during all the presentation, that he said that he wanted to be there, so I'll let him comment on that. It doesn't shock me. What I would be curious about is that maybe an alternative question, which is, do you think you can attend more meetings? Are the meetings more accessible? So I understand engagement, but I also think accessibility is another factor, particularly for the people who don't normally come.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great point. Kevin, what are your thoughts?
Well, as I said before, and we need to have face-to-face contact. And I think that for the public, they need to see us. They need to talk to us. They need to be able to read our faces. We need to be able to hear them to understand how they're feeling, their emotions. When you get online, it's very easy to become distracted. Where it is convenient is when you have meetings outside of those public meetings. I mean, everything I go to is public, but it is convenient when I don't have to drive a long way, and it's stuff you're just trying to get some business done. So that's very convenient. But I think that the public meetings are the way to go. It's critical that we talk to each other and look each other in the eye.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. There's that person connection that you miss a little bit in virtual meetings for sure. So I did want to make a note that we do have one more live poll going on the Slido app. So make sure you log in. Again, the code is forward 5. And the other rating poll that we are going to kind of jump back to in a little bit is on a 1 to 5 scale. How would you rate your experience using virtual platforms for public meetings? So I'm going to put kind of a pin in that one and we'll come back to it. But jumping over to some live Q&A questions and comments from our live audience. I do want to say, Bill, you were very popular. It looks like someone in particular said that this was the first that they've attended, and their suggestion is that you should always be the moderator. They complimented your humor and wit.
That may have been me participating under an alias.
I mean, he does that because of our support, right?
Exactly.
There you go. So I do have a question. This is probably more for Mike. Laura Roten says, I like the convenience of watching from home, but I don't like not being able to comment in real time, whether during public comments or at a particular item. So her city particularly accepts letters ahead of the meeting. How do we fix that part?
So I think the question of how we fix that part, keep in mind we're in a temporary situation here that we got thrown into against our will, right? You know, it wasn't anyone's choice to start going virtual. This, you know, the situation happened and we had to go virtual and everyone had to make the best of it. So, you know, I think ideally we're used to having public comments in person, spoken face to face. And I think I think we're going to get back to that, whether it's virtual or in person. But I think it's just a matter of time and comfort level with the system, and you know, figuring out how public comments are really going to work. So, I mean, I guess my suggestion there is just to hang tight and make sure we're keeping in mind that we want to get back to that point. But in the meantime, we need public meetings to be able to work and function.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Another one of the questions kind of tied to it is in regards to one individual said they're interested in how you recommend taking roll call in a virtual environment when it can take 15 minutes just to identify who's participating in the meeting. We've taken roll verbally for voting members and asked participants to self-identify in chat. Is that a legal approach? And then I guess I'll tee it off first to Mike, and then Bill, if you want to also, I know you recently attended one of the SCAG meetings, so if you want to talk about maybe that example too, that'd be great.
And that's a great question. You know, again, I hate to keep going back to this as like a crutch, but we started out in this unexpectedly, right? So the idea is in the Brown Act, you have to take a roll call vote when you're teleconferencing. That way, you know, it's different from being in the room. You can hear each person on the teleconference and what their vote is. We're in a situation now where I think if you're using an electronic platform like a Zoom and there's some voting button or, you know, something like the poll that we did as part of this, you know, I think that effectively does the same thing, because you're showing the vote live of each board member. But we do still have the Brown Act rule that says a roll call vote. So I think the easiest thing to do until there is a change or an investment in the Brown Act is just to go through it, call each person by name, have them put their vote on the record. And, you know, maybe it takes a little more preparation. Maybe you have the city clerk or someone like that prepared with the list of names. That way you're not checking them off as you go through and things like that. So maybe just a little more preparation, but I think the verbal roll call vote is the best thing to do right now. And I hope in the future we do something else.
I agree with what Mike said from a city attorney perspective. As somebody who also works in Sacramento and dealing with the policy and asking the question, what should it be, not what it is, I think it is time to have a conversation about how we integrate what we've learned into the Brown Act. I hear from local officials across the state that I work with that, you know, there's some value here. And what we need to do is sit down with the transparency and First Amendment advocates, often from newspapers and other open government groups, and have a conversation about the benefits of this and how do we protect the principles of the Brown Act without compromising, you know, having these tools compromise those principles. And so I think it's time to have a conversation, and I hope that we see legislation next year that addresses some of these issues, you know, online. Do we really need to hear every person say aye or nay if we can put up on a screen how everybody voted, and is that the same thing? And I think in many ways it is. And if it is the functional equivalent, we need to be able to insert that. I'll say one more thing. So far, I think we've been talking and thinking mostly about our city council meetings. But you mentioned the SCAG meeting, which is 191 cities over a region adopting a couple months ago the regional transportation plan. And I believe they had 600 people monitoring either engaged in the Zoom squares or monitoring on YouTube. And they're given the size of a regional government and the difficulty of traveling to the meeting, even if it's Western Riverside Council of Governments, you've got to travel 3 or 4 cities over sometimes just to get to a meeting. Having a virtual tool to engage in the meeting helps those governments function better and be in touch with the citizens that they're serving.
Definitely. Kevin, do you think you can maybe talk? I want to hear from you in regards to some of the best practices that you've seen attending meetings, especially with roll call specifically, as that's kind of the question that is at hand right now. What have been some of the best practices?
To be honest, the largest meetings I go to is the Western Regional Council of Government meetings. It seems to go very smoothly.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of just do the roll call, and it's handled very well. RCA has been dark, but essentially, as we've been talking about city council meetings, there's just 5 of us.
Mm-hmm.
So it's essentially pretty easy.
Yeah, for sure.
These guys have much more experience than I do in that area.
So we're going to jump back over to the poll, actually, one of the live polls that we had. And like I mentioned, the question was from 1 to 5, 5 being excellent. How would you rate your experience using virtual platforms for public meetings? And so overall, we had a score of an average of about 4.2 stars out of 5. And so, Kevin, I'm curious, where would you put yourself on a 1 to 5 scale in regards to your experience using virtual platforms? 1 being not so great, 5 being superb.
For our council meetings, I would have to put it at 1, and that's not to say our staff doesn't work hard. It's just that component that you can't see who's talking to you. It makes it very difficult. We've had some very contentious issues during this pandemic, and we literally have to sit through dozens of letters, and it just doesn't have the same impact. You don't have the people there telling you what they want. In terms of meetings, WRCOG, RCA, those different ones where you'd have a limited group of people, very convenient because I have to drive to Riverside. There's a lot of places I would have to drive to, and it's nice that I can just go to the meeting online and then I can get to some other things. So I'd have to give that a 5 and give the public meetings a 1. But I have to say our staff has organized those meetings very, very well. We have very good media, and we've done everything we can to make sure that people are heard. So I'd have to give 5 to the WRCOG folks, and I'd have to give a 1 just because the public isn't there to our regular council meetings.
That community engagement is a different kind of a challenge, especially on a virtual platform, that's for sure. So teeing it back over to the live Q&A, I did want to ask another question. So someone wrote, what are your thoughts about what happens when the system or the virtual system goes down? And they said that this happened recently with Zoom. So Mike, maybe what are some of your thoughts with how do cities and jurisdictions or agencies even proceed when something that we're relying so heavily on, what happens when it goes down?
And I mentioned this earlier in the conversation. I think it's a new platform, but an old challenge. When I sat for the bar exam, I had about 10 minutes left and an earthquake hit. And we had no idea if we were going to finish the bar exam or not. So it's, there's anything you're doing in life, no matter how critical it feels to you, there's always a risk that there's going to be interruptions. We could have a rolling blackout if we're at City Hall or somewhere like that. So I think you just always have to be prepared that unexpected things are going to happen and figure out how to roll with them. Particularly with technology, it's just a matter of when it's going to happen, not if it's going to happen. So I think just being prepared and making sure what I see as most important is making sure if your system goes down, that way you can stop and start back again. Whether that's later the same evening, whether you adjourn to the next day or 2 days from then. But just being ready to do that, making sure The other thing is, I think having somewhat of a plan in your back pocket. I know a lot of cities, including some of the cities I work with, had a contingency plan in place over the last couple of weeks, as we were told rolling blackouts are expected between 6 and 8 o'clock, which is, prime meeting time for a lot of city councils. So it was just, it's not like, we weren't running out and running generators and things like that. But just having a plan in your back pocket, okay, this might happen. If it does happen, what do we do? okay, worst case scenario, we announce we're adjourned, we come back tomorrow, something like that. And it doesn't have to be complicated, but just thinking through those contingencies, I think is worthwhile.
Definitely. So kind of closing out.
Not to interrupt, but in our last session, forgive me, you probably didn't notice, but my lights began to go in and out. That's why I was getting dark and light, and I was going, oh my goodness. And it was Edison was doing whatever they were doing, trying to get me power. And I thought I was going to be gone. I just thought I'd bring that up.
I just thought your room lighted every time you had a good idea.
That would be very rare, like once every 6 months, there's a bulb. Yeah.
Well, I do want to be mindful of our time. And so kind of closing out our discussion, I want to end with a final question for maybe Kevin and Bill. But looking forward, what in your ideal situation, circumstances, what would you like to see for public meetings? And I'll keep it pretty broad on purpose just so you guys can tailor it to however you would like. So Bill, do you want to start us off, and then Kevin, will you close us out?
I think that what the fundamental principle that we've been talking about here is just what is a good meeting, and if what we've learned lately has changed that, and I think the answer is yes. So for me, the question is going forward, what changes do we need to make in law and other things so that we can continue accessibility and maintain our transparency. And I think that there's a lot of conversation to be had about that going forward.
Kevin, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with that. I get that we're now on a path that maybe we didn't choose. We are going to have to figure out ways to utilize the technology, and the technology I suspect will take a quantum leap in the next 2-3 years. It's very convenient for the smaller meetings, but I'm hoping that when this whole thing is over, we're going to be able to get back to talking to each other. There's a lot of studies being done that we're training people to talk into machines, and they've lost the ability to talk to human beings. And I'm really, really, really concerned about that. I mean, City of Norco, we geared up, we created all kinds of programs to reach out so that, our senior centers, our fields are closed. So we created all these virtual, and they're very successful. But ultimately, we need to talk. So I'm hoping we will get back to that, and I'm actually pretty worried about it.
Definitely. Well, awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for taking the time to be on our Future Forward. I do want to make a quick note to our audience. If we did not have time to get to your question, we will go ahead and connect with our speakers offline, if you will, and we will get that sent to you via email, as well as the full broadcast too. So again, thank you to our participants, thank you to our audience, and I'm passing it back over to you, Elisa.
Thank you, Rachel, and our esteemed panel. And of course, thank you to all of our viewers out there for tuning in to today's episode. Again, if you're new to our channel, please make sure you subscribe right down below. Also, make sure that you hit the like button. Helps us to know whether you like the content or not. And before we sign off, we look forward to seeing you at our next broadcast, which will be held on September 24th from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. We'll be getting the registration page out to y'all soon. And stay tuned for those exciting details. Lastly, I want to remind everyone, don't forget to recycle your used oil. Until next time, see you guys later. Stay tuned for our next broadcast. See you then.